Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has chosen to answer Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan in unusually direct and personal terms, pushing an already strained relationship into something more volatile, a public clash between two leaders who both trade in strength, defiance, and political theater, and whose countries sit on some of the region's most sensitive fault lines. This is happening at a moment when the Middle East is already overloaded with overlapping crises. Israel's security focus is stretched across multiple directions, from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria, while Iran remains central to Israel's strategic calculations. Into that mix now comes another pressure point, a sharpening political confrontation with Turkey, a major regional military power and a NATO member whose choices matter not only in Middle Eastern diplomacy, but also in Washington and European capitals. What makes this moment different is not that Ankara is criticizing Israeli policy. Erdogan has been among the loudest voices condemning Israel's actions in recent months, framing Turkey as a state unwilling to stay silent as instability deepens. The shift is that Netanyahu is no longer keeping the dispute at arm's length through formal diplomatic language and policy rebuttals. Instead, he has elevated Erdogan himself as the target, turning a disagreement into a leader-to-leader confrontation. That personal turn is not cosmetic. Once political disputes become personal, they tend to narrow the runway for de-escalation. The stakes stop being only about interests and start becoming about prestige, image, and dominance, especially when both leaders can present themselves at home as standing firm against outside pressure. Netanyahu's latest message signaled exactly that posture. He said, "Israel, under my leadership, will continue to fight Iran's terror regime and its proxies," a line designed to underline resolve and project consistency in Israel's regional posture. But he went further, drawing a stark contrast with the Turkish leader. He said, unlike Erdogan, who accommodates them and massacred his own Kurdish citizens, that is not a routine policy disagreement. It is a public accusation aimed directly at Erdogan's legitimacy and record. From Ankara's perspective, the response was immediate and angry. Turkish officials framed Netanyahu's remarks as an attempt to deflect from scrutiny and to punish Turkey for speaking out. Ankara's pushback was broad, coordinated, and deliberately loud, an early signal that Turkey intends to treat this as more than passing rhetoric. The reason this matters is that Turkey is not just another regional capital issuing statements from afar. It has reach and leverage across multiple arenas that matter to Israel: Syria, the Eastern Mediterranean, maritime security, regional diplomacy, and influence in Muslim-majority public opinion. It also sits inside NATO, which complicates the wider strategic picture for the United States and Europe. If Israel-Turkey ties continue to fray, in practical terms, this confrontation opens the possibility of what can be called a second front, not necessarily a direct military showdown between Israel and Turkey, which would be extreme and would carry enormous consequences. But a second front can mean a second strategic pressure point: sustained diplomatic, political intelligence, and regional posture resistance driven by a state with real capacity and institutional standing. That is the real risk in a dispute like this. The danger lies in everything short of open conflict. Turkey has options that allow it to raise the cost for Israel without crossing into an immediate crisis. It can intensify diplomatic pressure in international forums. It can sharpen its public posture across Muslim-majority countries and attempt to marshal broader political alignment. It can increase coordination with states already critical of Israel. It can signal militarily in nearby theaters, especially in reteam zones and in discussions tied to Eastern Mediterranean security, and it can insert itself more aggressively into conversations around Gaza ceasefire diplomacy, humanitarian access, and post-war political arrangements, areas where international pressure can become persistent and difficult for Israel to manage. For Netanyahu, the calculation may be that confronting Erdogan head-on strengthens his domestic image, the leader who refuses to bend under pressure, no matter where it comes from. That political stance has long been part of his brand, and in a moment of national strain, defiance can be a tempting political asset. But the gamble is that a move meant to project strength could create a new strategic problem at the worst possible time, one that drains diplomatic bandwidth, complicates regional maneuvering, and invites Ankara to build a longer-term pressure architecture that does not fade with a news cycle. There is also a risk that Netanyahu is underestimating Erdogan's ends. Tinks for turning confrontation into leverage. Erdogan has spent years presenting Turkey as an assertive, independent power, one willing to challenge perceived Western double standards and insist on a central role in regional affairs. A high-profile clash with Israel's prime minister can strengthen Erdogan's message to his base and to broader audiences that Turkey is standing up for regional causes when other powers appear hesitant or divided. That creates a dangerous dynamic. Both leaders can benefit politically from escalation. Netanyahu can argue he is protecting Israel from foreign pressure and refusing to be lectured. Erdogan can argue he is refusing to be intimidated and is speaking for a wider moral cause. When both sides find political value in toughening their stance, the incentive for quiet compromise shrinks. Even if neither side wants a wider confrontation, escalation can become self-sustaining because it plays well domestically and because backing down becomes political. Why costly? This is especially risky because the surrounding regional environment is already tense. Gaza remains at the center of regional diplomacy and public outrage. Lebanon remains a flashpoint with Hezbollah and Israel locked in a dangerous cycle that repeatedly threatens to broaden. Syria remains unstable and contested, a theater where multiple powers operate in close proximity. Maritime routes and energy corridors remain sensitive, and any additional friction in the eastern Mediterranean can create new calculations for military planners and markets alike. In that setting, opening a new major quarrel with Turkey is not a side issue. It adds another unpredictable variable to a system already close to overload. For Washington, it creates a particularly awkward dilemma. Israel remains one of America's closest partners in the region. Turkey, despite years of friction with Western capitals, remains a treaty ally inside NATO and occupies a strategic geographic position that matters or alliance planning and regional security. If the feud deepens, the United States can find itself trying to calm two partners whose interests increasingly clash. An extremely difficult balancing act when the rhetoric becomes public and personal. European capitals face a similar discomfort. Many European governments have had difficult relations with Ankara at different times, but few can ignore Turkey's importance. Turkey's role in alliance planning, migration management, Black Sea security, and regional diplomacy ensures it cannot simply be sidelined. As Israel-Turkey tensions rise, Europe faces pressure to decide how directly to engage, how far to go in private mediation, and whether this confrontation risks spilling over into wider strategic cooperation. What makes Netanyahu's approach look especially risky is the symbolic dimension. Turkey has long insisted it cannot be excluded from major regional decisions, whether in Syria, Libya, the Caucasus, or the Eastern Mediterranean, Ankara. Raw's posture has repeatedly signaled that it wants a seat at the table and is prepared to push for it. If Turkish leadership concludes that Israel is not merely disagreeing with Turkey but disrespecting it, the pressure on Erdogan to respond grows. And his response does not have to be a single dramatic move. It can be a series of steps, each short of open confrontation, that collectively build sustained pressure. That might mean more aggressive diplomatic campaigning day after day in international bodies. It might mean louder Turkish objections and transatlantic discussions, forcing allies to grapple with the dispute. It might mean more visible Turkish military signaling in nearby maritime zones, time to remind everyone that Ankara is a serious regional actor. It might mean deeper coordination with governments that already want to constrain Israel's freedom of action. It might mean stronger attempts to shape ceasefire diplomacy in a way that boxes Israel in politically. Each individual's UL action could be presented as normal statecraft, but taken together, they could become a second front of strategic pressure. And once that kind of pressure architecture begins to form, reversing it becomes hard. Public statements harden. Nationalist audiences demand follow-through. Quiet diplomacy becomes politically expensive. Intelligence communities reassess risks and assumptions. Military planners start gaming contingencies they hoped never to consider. Investors and markets watch regional stability with fresh anxiety. Even if nothing dramatic happens in the short term, the atmosphere changes and trust shrinks. That is the critical point. A personal feud between leaders is not just noise. It can quietly reshape calculations across several theaters at once. Turkey's leverage is not limited to rhetoric. It sits at the intersection of multiple strategic files. Syria, where Ankara holds influence and maintains a security posture. The Eastern Mediterranean, where maritime and energy disputes can be sharpened through signaling. And the broader diplomatic arena, where Turkey has experience mobilizing international attention and shaping narratives. As a NATO member, Turkey also carries institutional weight that few regional states can match. Even when relations with Western capitals are strained, Ankara's position inside the alliance gives it channels and tools that amplify its voice. For Israel, the potential costs go beyond the bilateral relationship itself. A deeper deterioration with Turkey can complicate intelligence coordination in sensitive theaters. It can affect regional maritime posture. It can shape the climate around ceasefire negotiations and humanitarian arrangements. It can create friction points that third parties, state and non-state, may try to exploit. Netanyahu's strategic environment is already crowded with threats and dilemmas. Adding another major contest with a powerful state risks thinning the bandwidth of Israeli diplomacy and defense play. NET at precisely the wrong time. At the same time, Erdogan's own calculus is not purely ideological. He has shown repeatedly that he can combine moral rhetoric with strategic bargaining, using confrontation to extract leverage and signal Turkey's importance. If the confrontation with Netanyahu becomes a sustained storyline, Erdogan may see an opportunity to reinforce Turkey's claim to regional leadership, especially if he can depict Israel as isolated and depict Turkey as the state willing to act, speak, and pressure. The problem is that when both leaders view escalation as useful, the dispute becomes more likely to continue, even if the underlying national interests would be better served by lowering the temperature. This is why the personal nature of Netanyahu's attack matters so much. By accusing Erdogan of accommodating Iran and by tying that accusation to a charge of violence against Kurds, Netanyahu made the argument not only about Gaza or regional diplomacy, but about Erdogan. And once a leader feels personally targeted, the response often shifts from policy disagreement to political standing. That is when compromise becomes harder and when symbolic gestures begin to matter as much as material ones. The region does not need another high-stakes rivalry layered onto existing crises, yet that is what this moment now threatens to create: a new, unpredictable line of tension running alongside wars, ceasefires, and power struggles already underway. A direct Israel-Turkey military collision remains a distant and extreme scenario. But strategic pressure doesn't require open conflict to be effective. It can be diplomatic isolation, coordinated messaging, institutional friction, maritime signaling, and sustained political resistance day after day, meeting after meeting, forum after forum. And in an environment already strained, that kind of pressure can compound fast. The bigger question now is whether either leader chooses to step back before the dispute hardens into a new regional constant. Because if it does, it won't just be another exchange of insults. It could become a lasting strategic problem, one that forces outside powers to manage it, forces regional actors to position around it, and forces both countries to treat each other less as difficult counterparts and more as active obstacles. Even if nothing explodes tomorrow, the trajectory matters. Once trust erodes and contingency planning begins, relationships take on inertia. What starts as rhetoric can become posture. What becomes policy can take years to unwind. Right now, the warning sign is not simply that the rhetoric is intense, it's that it has become personal and that both leaders may believe they gain by keeping it that way.